And one of the more shocking facts as well in the space that I work in is that despite, African women being the most entrepreneurially active in the world, we still receive less than 14% of all funding that goes to startups across the continent. And this really, struck me because we have a very young startup ecosystem. And that is when you would believe that, funding should be distributed wherever talent exists, independent of what form that talent takes shape. But this figure has been the same for close to a decade, and we've not necessarily moved the needle in terms of getting more funding to deserving women. So I guess my why and really what I'm trying to really bring into the world is trying to understand, what does a gender equal world look like, particularly in the realm that I'm in, which is venture capital investing, but also transcending to spheres in terms of the workplace and in corporate. How can we really drive equity in the way women are not necessarily are compensated, but also the types of opportunities that women have? And, for me, there's like 3 key things, just leveraging from Stacey Abrams, in terms of how we can begin to build a just world, particularly one that recognizes the efforts of women and compensates them accordingly. I think, this quote, I know it's quite common and it's used quite a lot, but I really love it. And it really speaks about, you can't connect the dots looking forward, and you can only connect them looking backwards. And you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something. And really, for me, the reason why I bring understanding your why into this conversation is, fighting against systemic structures or trying to change the status quo is a very difficult journey, and one that you're only able to kind of persevere against if you understand your why, and your why becomes the source of what keeps you going. And for me, that has been the case. So I grew up in Soweto, great family, but Soweto is one where, it's an impoverished community where you don't have access to opportunities, don't have access to money to afford certain basics sometimes. But one of the things that I was always inspired by is the use of entrepreneurship to drive change, right? So you go to any township and you see car washes, you see hair salons, you see spaza shops, and it's people who are trying to solve for their need for money through creating opportunities for themselves. And I think this is something that I grew up around and was always inspired by, but I became obsessed with the question of not understanding, why are these businesses not growing? Why can't a spaza shop become as big as a Spar or Pick and Pay? Why can't a hair salon become a franchise? And as a child, I think these are the questions that I would ask myself, but I didn't necessarily have the right language, right, in terms of what we say today. Why aren't they scaling? But these are always questions in my formative years I used to kind of ask. And I always knew that, okay, I want to be involved in business, but I want my business to be a little bit bigger and then help other people also grow their businesses to be bigger. And then I attended university at the University of Cape Town and, studied a BCom undergrad in accounting, and then did my honors in entrepreneurship. And throughout my time in UCT, I think I sought out experiences that would enhance my understanding of what an entrepreneur ought to be. So, I took part in UCT-sponsored opportunities like Startup India, took part in an entrepreneurial program at Stanford, and as mentioned, switched my honors from a CA route to entrepreneurship, because I think I really had this desire to kind of understand what makes a good entrepreneur in this world, and how can you use entrepreneurship as a tool to kind of drive change, socioeconomic change. Post that, I joined a management consulting firm. And I think for me, what was key, it was the first introduction towards understanding the disparities that exist between men and women in the world, especially in the world of work. And when I joined, there were primarily male senior leaders and male senior partners, and a bulk sort of junior workforce of women, right? And I would see concepts like the glass ceiling coming into effect where women wouldn't get promoted, etc. So this is where my activism for how do women get equal access to opportunities really started. So I started co-leading the Women's Network at Ditlhakanye, and in parallel, I started an organization called the Superwoman Hub. And that organization was really to make sure that the conversations transcend beyond my workplace in terms of the experiences that other women are facing. And then, how do we then take the conversations and the collection of experiences to start ideating around solutions? And really, that was the work of the Superwoman Hub, to kind of organize events, bring, people, women who are at C-suite level, to kind of share a lot of their experiences around how they navigated the systemic structures, how they ensured that they brought other women up as well, how they also build allyship with their male colleagues to ensure that there is that inclusion in terms of how they also contribute towards a just world. So really, a lot of that work, was done under that umbrella of Superwoman Hub. But being able to champion that in my workplace, regardless of how hard it was to be a junior woman, having conversations with partners around why they need to diversify, I think that really was the start of my activism and really trying to understand what is the gap that I want to address in the world. So then really the transition to the venture capital space was combining the two, the passion for entrepreneurship and its ability to drive socioeconomic change, as well as recognizing that there is this gender gap that exists. For women, things are a lot harder in terms of getting access to funding, getting access to market opportunities, and then how do I bridge the two to kind of hopefully leverage capital and leverage entrepreneurship as a lever towards bridging that gender equality gap. So, in terms of just connecting the dots, I think the key things from my journey is, number one, making sure that you can reflect often. I think it's only in hindsight when you're able to kind of connect the dots and understand, the things that you're passionate about, the things that angered you about the world, and how all these come together with your skills as well as your experiences to kind of contribute towards your bigger why. And then the second thing as well is trusting in something, including yourself. And I think this is something that is, you develop over time, because what happens when you're exposed to a systemic structure that tells you that you can't do something is that starts informing your own opinion around your own limitations, which are most often false, right? So I think just starting to build your relationship with yourself, where you understand where your skills are, your own identity, and what impact you want to make, and then starting to trust that in a world that won't give that to you is quite clear as well. And I think the combination of that is what, for me, builds a very self-aware leader, and a leader that could be able to navigate the different challenging systems, but also challenging systems in a changing world that will ultimately get us one step closer towards building that just world. The second one is sort of this idea of the talent stack. I think historically, a lot of people have put content out in the world that talks about how it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in one skill. And that thinking has shifted over time towards this idea of the talent stack, and is to say that you don't necessarily need to be the best in the world at one skill. You can combine a set of ordinary skills until you have just enough mixture of them to be able to be extraordinary. And this idea has really, I guess, transcended our understanding in terms of how do you start building an edge, and how do you recognize that human nature in itself is multifaceted and diverse. And the uniqueness, therefore, comes from not burning yourself to kind of be top 1% in any one thing, but rather recognizing that the way you can combine different things that exist in this world and different skills, different experiences, can produce a unique blueprint that develops or helps you develop your edge. This is quite important to kind of then parallel with understanding your why, because oftentimes, whatever you're passionate about, there are people that are working in that space. And for it to be additive, you need to understand what is your edge that is going to push the needle forward in terms of the progress that we are making towards bridging whatever social justice gap. So this self-reflection is quite key, so that you can understand what is the unique set of experiences, skills, and insights that you'll be bringing to the broader conversation to allow movement forward towards progress that will be made. And, this is just my personal skills stack, where, I always like to think about the skills that I have in two buckets, being strategy and creativity. Strategy, really just having an intuitive ability to problem solve. And I think this is something through working with the coach, I've been able to identify that from a very young age to now, I've been really good at relying on my intuition to drive decisions. And a lot of the times, it has produced quality decisions, both in the context of work, but even in the way that I think about my career or even things in my personal life. The second one is just that innate understanding of human behavior. I always think that I should have studied psychology back in university, because I do have this fascination around how people think, how people make decisions, how people are affected by biases, and those biases feed into opinions about themselves and others. So then being able to leverage that thinking and evolving it over time is quite a key strength, particularly in the world of work, where really all we're doing is managing people towards a common goal, and understanding how people respond, how people act, and how people are incentivized is quite key towards delivering any strategy. And then the last one is just being able to have foresight and spotting trends before they become a thing. And this is obviously quite key in the industry that I'm in. You know, we are investing in technologies that are redefining the future, and essentially being able to kind of understand and visualize what the future might look like and invest in it today is quite a key skill in the industry that I'm in. So then those form under the bucket of strategy. And then there's the creativity part of it. Although the school system sort of benefits people who use the left side of their brain, I'm one of those people who've tried to seek out experiences to use the right side of my brain, because I'm quite a creative individual. So then these become my unique skill set, which is quite different from a colleague of mine who might be more analytical with strategy, or somebody else who might be more relationship building focused as opposed to creative. And I think it's quite key just to establish what your unique talent stack is, because then that informs the edge that you'll be bringing to the conversation around building good. And then essentially in terms of the work that I do and how I've brought it all together. So as mentioned, you know, for me, I wanted to combine sort of that opportunity to leverage entrepreneurship as a lever towards bridging socioeconomic challenges in the world that we face. And then the other side of it is how could we also use it as a lever towards getting more women funded, because the more women we fund, the more they can create innovative solutions that our society needs, but then they also can build up wealth so that they can fund other women. So it becomes sort of a flywheel on its own. And that is what I want to help unlock. And essentially, you know, in terms of the organization, We Fund Women, so we launched last year in 2020. We've launched sort of a podcast where we are profiling exceptional women founders across the continent in order to increase visibility and allow them to tell their stories. This is quite a key initiative towards building a just world, because most often women's stories are excluded from history. We aren't represented enough in terms of concepts around leadership, concepts around, you know, women heroes, right? Our stories aren't told enough. So the same way Africa is really written out of history in terms of, you know, the rich resources that we have, the incredible hero monarchies that we had in Africa, and a lot of that has been written out. I think the same thing has happened to women, where our stories aren't being told enough, so that we don't contribute towards, you know, what does good leadership look like. It's very masculine in the way it's been defined. So the podcast really is building this live playbook of women founders who never get featured on articles on the tech crunches of the world, to kind of profile the work that they're doing and hopefully contribute towards empowering other investors to have visibility towards them and then channel funding. The second one is actually investing in women. So we're putting our money where our mouth is. And to date, we've invested in 4 women-led startups who've gone on to have incredible success. So one, for example, is a 3Demo, so founded by a South African CEO from the Northwest. We've invested in her and we work with her to kind of channel more follow-on funding. Currently, she's closed more funding in the US, so she's permanently moved to San Francisco, which is the venture capital capital of the world, so to say. And she's been able to raise money from various investors across the world, right? And a lot of it was just helping her really just be firm in her identity, as well as the change that she wants to drive in this world. And then being able to bridge that gap to investors, being able to advocate for her, sponsor her, and then essentially she was able to kind of reach very good results. And then the last one is in terms of sort of running one of the largest databases for women-led ventures across the continent. So often a lot of the reasons that investors give for the reason why they don't have diversity in terms of where they channel funding is we don't know where the women are. So then for us, we've crowdsourced all the information on the internet about where women are, and then also from the investments and the engagement that I have with women on a daily basis, and put it all on a database. So currently it's close to 150 startups, and it's growing each month. And our goal is to get to 500 or even 1,000, to never give anybody an excuse in terms of why they can't invest in a woman, because every woman that has started a tech startup across the continent will be on one centralized database. So that is more on, the activism, and the hope over the years is for this to grow, to kind of allow more people to understand how do they back women, because I won't be able to bridge that gender gap alone. I definitely think it takes a lot of education, and it takes a lot of community in order to work towards that end goal. And then also the second part of it in terms of my role at Founders Factory is, really aligning with organizations as well that are trying to contribute differently to that conversation. And the organization that I work for now, called Founders Factory Africa, really what I've profiled is their talent stack, right? To say, how did they take existing models that exist across the entire ecosystem, but combine them in a new, unique way that is making a difference across the continent? The first one being, we leverage venture capital as an instrument. So typically a founder can have multiple different ways to raise funds for their business. It could be government funded, it could be grants, it could be debt, but then there's also equity. And this equity often comes from a vehicle called venture capital. So that is the instrument that they've leveraged, but then mixing it with sort of what we call corporate venture capital. So then essentially a number of corporates, even in South Africa, like your Nedbank, your Standard Bank, have different arms that invest in startups. And essentially for us, it's saying, how can we get Standard Bank into the conversation? Because Standard Bank has presence across the continent. So essentially being able to leverage the expertise and the distribution that they have across the continent to ensure that the startups that we invest in are able to have that added advantage in the way they can grow and scale very quickly. And then the third part of it is, there's a number of accelerators and incubators. I know that UCT GSB runs their own incubator. How do we leverage that as well? But then instead of having external mentors that we bring in to coach startups, we have an internal team that works day to day with founders towards helping them meet their goal. And, for me, I think this organization and the impact that we are making is really just driving a lot of change across the continent in terms of making sure that people who ordinarily would be overlooked in terms of funding actually get access to funding. So to date, we've invested in close to 30 startups, and I head up the division that identifies, who we should be funding, and then essentially lead the process to get them into our portfolio, doing this both in South Africa, but across the continent in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and Uganda, and some of the other African countries. And really, I think I've seen firsthand the power of entrepreneurship to kind of bridge that gap, where you have founders who wouldn't have gotten funding, some of them couldn't go to school, and now they're able to kind of evolve in this journey. And here's just, in terms of then that external validation of some of the work that I've done, and how it's all come together, and the recognition that I've received as a result. And then I think the last part of it that I'd like to chat about, because I think my 15 minutes is nearly up, is, there's understanding your why, and then there's also understanding what unique talents and how you bring your talents together to develop an edge so that you're able to solve the problem in a different way and be more additive as opposed to doing what has been done before. But there are a couple of key things in order to sustain that change. The first one being, once you move out of the schooling system and you go into sort of the world of work, there's a level of uncertainty in the way that you navigate your own career, particularly in any kind of activism work that you'd like to do, but also in terms of the fact that the world is forever changing, right? There's new technologies every time. There's new issues that are being brought to light every time through the power of technology. And essentially, one of the key things is to embrace that level of uncertainty. So being comfortable with making decisions with very little information. I think most times you won't always know what the right answer is, but you have to be really good at trying to understand what is the minimum level of information that you're comfortable with actually making decisions on. The second one is particularly in trying to build or trying to create any kind of change is pursuing intellectual honesty. So then being able to really understand the difference between opinion and facts, both in yourself in terms of how much of your own personal experiences are feeding into your perception of the problem versus what can be validated by a study, by research, or by external organizations as fact. So when I showed you guys the statistics around women are not being paid and are not being promoted, it's not just leveraging, my own personal experience or the experiences of the people in my network, but research studies and facts, right? So that empowers me to kind of know that I'm solving for the right problem, and not something that I've been biased towards solving just because I personally experienced it. So I think in building a just world, pursuing intellectual honesty is one of the key things in order to make sure that, number one, you can rally people into the journey that you're on, but number two, that you're solving for the right problem. The third one is being able to kind of understand, and I think it's linked to that embracing uncertainty, that sometimes the way you start off isn't the way you're going to continue. And, this is just an example for me where when I started the Superwoman Hub, and for me, a lot of it was, how can I just focus on any woman in any industry and really just help them get access to leadership opportunities, right? And while there is a lot of work that we did in that space, because I didn't start from my immediate sphere of influence, it became a lot harder to kind of keep up with the cadence of what that endeavor required. And since, the Superwoman Hub evolved towards We Fund Women, and essentially I was comfortable making that pivot, and I think a lot of the women who supported those efforts are still part of We Fund Women, but it's just really trying to understand, for me, the pivot was, what is in my immediate sphere of influence? What are my immediate skills and things that I am aware of? And entrepreneurship is a skill that I've acquired over the years, and then essentially being able to make such a pivot. So I guess the key thing here is that life is a consistent exercise of learning and unlearning, and you just have to accept that. And then the last one, which I think is quite key, is the power of collaboration and community. I think for me, if we really are to build a just world, you can't do it alone. You need to do it in collaboration with communities. I think most oftentimes, people love being the hero, right? And it's natural. I think it's the psychology of a human where you want to see the impact that you've made. So therefore, you want to be able to be the one to do something. But going at it alone will only take you so far. So you might have some level of impact, but I argue that it would not be sustained change. So one of the key levers for growth, I think, in the work that I've done is starting to identify other people that have the same cause. Maybe they might be tackling it a little bit differently, to understand where can we collaborate, where can we share resources, and where can we contribute towards the broader education that needs to happen. Because as mentioned, there's a 42 billion financing gap for women in Africa. I'm not going to be the one to solve it. What's going to solve it is empowering existing investors to kind of understand, how do they firstly remove their biases in the way that they make investment decisions? How do they specifically look out women to invest in? And then how do they become comfortable with diversity as a principle of investing? So where I can make the biggest change is in that education component, to empower others to be able to channel their funds towards women. And really, this only comes about by creating and building communities. And that is what will sustain change over time. So thank you so much. And just wanted to share a little bit of an overview of what I believe we can do to create that just world. And it really just underpins those three principles.
Thank you so much, Hope, for that lovely presentation. I think, when you ask the question about, what is your why, and also, what does gender equality look like? I think for me, especially in relation to that surgeon about the question about the surgeon, for me, a gender equal world is me becoming a surgeon, personally, because I am an aspiring surgeon. So I kind of really related to that aspect of your conversation quite a lot. And I really do think you do really amazing work. And I'm hoping that, for just the last part of our conversation, we can sort of bring it, kind of bring the conversation together with what, Neoka has also done. I just also wanted to ask, I wanted to know from Neoka specifically. You wrote an essay. You didn't chat to us about it initially. In a book called "Feminism Is," and stories. I think it says "Feminism Is South Africans Speak Their Truth," in which you were trying to sort of explore the links between feminism and climate change. Do you want to just chat to us more about that? I'd love to hear about it.
Sure. So that was one of my favorite engagements that I've had over the years. And there was the second book that's called Living While Feminist. And so trying to bring together voices that engage in the space in using their own personal stories. And one of the best parts about writing that, besides the actual content of it, is that none of the authors received any money for engaging with the book itself, but all the proceeds went to the Reference Center in Cape Town. And I think that was one of the key aspects of that, is that you have to live in a feminist way, not just be like an armchair feminist. And so when we look at intersectionality, that's sort of how my essay brought it together. Is like it specifically spoke about feminism and diplomacy and the differentiation of the impacts of climate itself, subsequently the inclusive nature of what feminism as an ideology can actually bring to the table for trying to alleviate the impacts that have come through in terms of a linear, very capitalist, colonized way of looking at a Eurocentric way of engaging with our environment. And subsequently, the diplomacy element of, for example, the work that I did in the UNFCCC was trying to find the lowest common denominator. And that doesn't really inspire progress, and nor does it inspire ambition. And the thing, when we look at climate and when we look at environmental impacts, we need more ambitious ways of engaging in context-driven ways. But we can't do this in the way that we're currently operating in a diplomatic way. The essay itself highlights the lack of representation and when representation takes place. But further to that fact, I wrote it in 2016, I think, 2017, and I learned a lot more since then. And so I'm actually building on the content of that. And I think that that's something that Hope actually mentioned, is that you keep learning. And that's one of the things that you really need to take under wing, is that you don't always know, but when you do the best you can with what you know. And when you do better, when you know better, you do better. And so that's, I think, what I've learned through my career, but also like through learning from colleagues. And I think Hope highlighted it in that fantastic presentation. So yeah, that was what the essay sort of tried to encapsulate. But the other authors are phenomenal in all the books, and they actually started a podcast in interviewing the authors from when they started and writing the essay and what has changed. And I think that element of change is super important to recognize.
Thank you so much. I think in some of the, I don't think there are any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to continue and just try and find out from both of you. When you look at the workspace in which you found yourselves in, just coming out of your undergrad education, and how that's changed. Obviously, women face different challenges in the workspace. There are biases that you spoke about, Hope, and those exist in the workspace, in the professional workspace. So I want to find out from you, how has that changed, especially now in the COVID pandemic, when we're all sort of like working in a virtual environment? Is it still the same? Do you still face the same challenges, or is it, you still kind of, feel those, different, the hierarchy in the workplace, or, those gender biases in the workplace? Hope you can go first. And then we'll hear.
Happy to take this. So actually, McKinsey's recent report, so they launched it in 2020, and the report was really focused on seeing if there has been any change, right, and what's the impact of the pandemic. And unfortunately, things at that macro level have gotten worse for women, right? So what you found is that a number of women have actually exited the workforce as well. It has been harder to kind of build effective relationships and navigate the political climates of work environments for women as before, when you could have somebody face to face. With that being said, though, I do think we also have a lot more knowledge in terms of how do you actually navigate this for yourself. And I think that is the benefit of all these reports, right? Because before I read them, I always used to think that these experiences are unique to me. And that's what would make it feel so much overwhelming. And as I mentioned, when I started that organization, where I noticed that I'm not the only one. And I think sometimes that's the starting point. But really, I do think that what has changed is that we have better tools for us to kind of navigate these issues, but then also extend the same support to other women coming in. So we know better now, right? So things like internalized oppression don't become a thing because you know what you had to overcome. And then how do you create better opportunities for those who come after you? And those tools for me really are, I guess at that high level in terms of navigating the workplace, things like making sure that you have a sponsor and a mentor, right? I think a lot of women don't pursue sponsors. And essentially, if you don't have a sponsor, then you don't get access to particular opportunities that can highlight the work and your skills, etc. Then that cascades down to you can't get promoted, etc., etc., etc. So that's one of the things. I think the second one is, and I know that I did this in my management consulting days, making sure that leaders to managers, middle managers to juniors are aware of subconscious biases. I think whenever we bring up this topic, people tend to think that it's only men who have subconscious biases, but women as well tend to have subconscious biases, and just a broader awareness of how these feed into your perception of what good looks like in the workplace, your own perception of your own efforts, right? And sometimes that can be self-sabotaging. So just having this recognition of what biases do you hold and how do you make sure that you understand when you are approached with a particular situation, the difference between that opinion and subconscious bias versus the fact, right? So things at the macro level haven't necessarily gotten easier, but I do think we have better tools to kind of start navigating these challenges and then essentially extend the same level of support to those who come after us.
Thank you so much, Hope. And Neoka, what is your perspective on, the work environment?
So, I mean, I really agree with Hope's eloquent answer, but I think mine is a little bit more anecdotal, that after 9 years of experience in the climate landscape, I still got called dear in one of my meetings, and I think my head almost exploded because I presented this like a strategy for national, and somebody was like, "Oh, thank you so much, dear," and I was just like, I'm definitely not the only presenter. I like this way of engaging in almost you highlighted it in your presentation where you sort of like you've completed this amazing task and it almost seems a little bit belittling that now you're being like it's. I mean I couldn't even put words to it, and at the time I was just so irritable. But I mean, it's happened so many times, like being the only female or young female in the meeting. Somebody's like, "Oh, would you like to take notes?" And I remember I was at a negotiation and we were meeting with the African Development Bank. So I decided to I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Augustine." And then he's like, "Oh, I don't have paper." And I was like, I ripped half my like exam pad or paper out. And then I was like, I think we're following different thematic areas. Why don't you take your own notes? And it's almost that moment when he said dear, I was just like, I don't have a snappy comeback at this point. But I wish I had more of those. And I feel like that should be like a collective job for all of us to have like snappy comebacks with sexist remarks. And it's functionally irritable because you work really hard and you're trying your best to work in pioneering spaces, and then met with almost this different level of internalized patriarchy is super problematic. And it's also like you try your best not to get upset and you let it go, but then there comes a time when you're like, I just did this amazing thing and now I'm irritated about the fact that the one person called me dear, So it's learning how not to let those little those pet peeves, Harsh, Harsh, the amazing things that you've actually achieved. So learning that different level of differentiation. And then, coming off Hope's point on mentorship, I think there's also the other side of it is seeing leadership that you really don't want to be and making sure that you don't perpetuate that. And different roles. And whether you're woman identifying or not, you see the different levels of people that internalize ways of oppressing people and almost being passive aggressive, and those sort of traits that you don't want to perpetuate because you've also experienced them yourself. So being aware of what you obviously want to achieve and how you can do that, but at the same time, actively not engaging in destructive behavior that is oppressive, not just for women, but just generally in terms of oppressed communities, whether it's racially, whether it's different sexual orientations, and being that level of intersectional leadership that's required to actually affect change. And I think that's something that we can all take forward.
Thank you so much, Neoka. I really do, appreciate, that advice in terms of, not letting the difficult situations that we face or not letting the challenges that we face in the workplace define who we are. Because there's a lot of negativity around the world, obviously, and there's also like a lot of biases, like Hope mentioned, ones which are also, subconscious that we may also project in other people. And I think with having had to listen to both of you and how level-headed both of you are, and how extremely experienced you are, and how amazing you are, I'd just like to find out who are some of the women or some of the people in your lives who have inspired you, people who've mentored you through your journey, be it in a personal capacity or in a more professional environment, and what are some of the things that helps you to cultivate that relationship with that person?
I'm going to follow up with this one because Kumeshni asked a question in the chat, which is, do you feel like there are enough women role models in your generation? And so picking up on that one, and I think in my personal landscape of people, I have amazing role models. One of them being Kumeshni. I've had, and almost seeking them out, Brenda Martin was the founding director of my first organization that literally helped me engage with the space that I was completely new to. And just like Makoma, Leka Lakala, who is from Life Africa, who was one of the main people that won the court case against the nuclear power plant. Kags Muko, who works on like gender and sexuality issues, and so also colleagues like Alia Kaji. And so there's just spaces where you engage and you find your tribe, but then you almost build a space of women identifying people that allow you to learn, and then also highlight from their own experience how they have subsequently found areas of divergence. That being said, I feel like just generally we don't amplify ourselves enough, and we amplify ourselves in like one-on-one conversations, and yes, having platforms like this is incredible, but on a larger scale, there comes a point where it's like it's Women's Month. And so we focus completely on women, people that identify as women, and that's amazing. And then then becomes September, and then it doesn't exist anymore. And so having that space where you want to continue the conversations and build this community, as you said, Hope, around it, but it almost falls to the back of being like, okay, well now I'm a climate person, or I'm working in healthcare. So where is that sense of community of also continuing that and then leveling that up into a broader space? And so I think, yes, we have enough role models on a one-to-one basis because we engage with them a little bit more deeper where we can, but having it in a space where there's more Serenas or there's more Naomi Osakas, and not just in the athlete space, but in not just the tech world, but having, like, I mean, where's more of the Wangari Maatais? I mean, there's hundreds of and thousands of them on the continent, but their voices haven't been elevated because either it's a cultural thing, they haven't been given the space or the time to actually articulate their voice. We always communicate in English. We're not reaching Indigenous communities. All of these factors on the intersectional space. I've taken up too much time, sorry.
Thank you so much, Neoka. Hope.
So I was enjoying that because I resonate with a lot of what Neoka was saying. I, at the first level, I do agree. I think there's exceptional women in our generation, but there's just not visibility to it, right? And I think as I referenced, that's why I was pushed to kind of start that podcast, because, I was tired of hearing that, there aren't women in tech, or there aren't women who have received VC funding. So I sought them out myself, and now I'm telling their stories. So I definitely think, creating more platforms that highlight women leadership is quite key, because a lot of the reason why we believe, or there is this false notion that it doesn't exist, it's because it isn't being highlighted enough and isn't being celebrated enough, but also isn't being documented enough to form its own playbook, right? And I think the classic argument in this is like MBA studies, right? In terms of how much of those case studies are diverse enough to ensure that people can feel represented, both from, I guess, geographies, in terms of making sure that we have stories from people from different parts of Africa, for example, but also in terms of like, what does a woman identifying leader look like, right? And a lot of the archetype around the leader has been built on the male identifying charisma and personality. So there's that level, I guess, in terms of just telling more stories and starting to build playbooks, and then having that feed into the content that we teach at schools and that we put out into the world. And then in terms of mentors, for me, I think, the way we think about mentors has changed over time. So I loved how Neoka mentioned a couple of different people, because I think before it was having one or two people that are quite key in driving your career forward, but really anyone can be your mentor. And I think technology has kind of democratized the opportunity for you to learn from a different set of people. So for me, I think I draw inspiration from multiple different people, both in my industry and not in my industry. I think I'm always a fan of like just understanding how people are thinking about their careers, how people are creating change. So for example, Stacey Abrams, right? It's in the political landscape, but I think it's quite key in terms of the way you can apply how she navigated driving change within that realm into your own space, right? It's very key. And it's what the playbook I'm adopting in terms of the tech space as well. So there's mentors. And I think for me, I also like to distinguish between mentors and sponsors. So in terms of mentors, I think there's many. In terms of sponsors, it has been both men and women, so male and men and women identifying individuals. And I think for me, it's really just being able to understand who has the right insight to where I want to take my career, who's able to kind of advocate for me when I'm not in the room, right? And be able to kind of drive the creation of opportunity on my behalf. And I think really just cultivating these relationships needs vulnerability and transparency. And I think just you also doing the work. So most oftentimes people would like saying, I want to be mentored, but they're not willing to actually do the work, right? So then I think just me also showing up, doing the work, doing the lessons, but also making sure that it's a value exchange. So not necessarily you just extracting, but you also offering. There's a concept called like reverse mentorship, and a number of C-suite level individuals are quite key to kind of learn from younger individuals, because the world is changing and younger people are much more in tune in terms of some of these changes. So making sure that there is that value exchange that is happening between two individuals. So it's not a data dump from the experienced individual to me, but rather how can we both understand how do we adapt to a changing world, and we have different perspectives that we can bring towards that, and that becomes the key that underpins that relationship. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Hope. I think that was very insightful, and to you, Neoka, too, as well. I think we all have different perspectives on what mentorship is, but I think sort of the common denominator is that people who inspire us and people inspire us to be better, and hopefully that there can be an exchange of knowledge between two parties. And yeah, I think I speak for everyone and I say, like, I've really learned a lot from today's discussion. And I really hope that it inspired also the people who are viewing this today, and that we can continue the conversation beyond Women's Month. Like Neoka said, we shouldn't only highlight the amazing things that women do, or all the amazing women that are there in South Africa or in the world. There's so much that we wish as the UCT SRC to highlight in our communities, and the amazing work that our alumni and also other women in the country are doing, to inspire other women and to also, bridge the inequality gap, the gaps that exist. And in a world like today, where you see what's happening in Afghanistan, I think a lot of people have been sharing this post about how what's happening is going to really set, feminism behind by 200 years. And I think we should really take these moments to sort of appreciate, the environment that we're in, and to appreciate the amazing women that we have with us today, and those around the country who are able to inspire us and do, real life-changing work. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate you coming through. I'm not sure if there are any questions in the chat or any comments, final comments.
I have one final comment, and I know we're running
Yes.
over. So
No, it's fine. Please go for it. Please go for it.
Just my piece of knowledge through trying to figure out myself, working, all of those different aspects. And I wrote it down when I was thinking about presenting today, and it says, everything may seem important, but not everything is a priority. Just because you can do it all doesn't mean you should. You need to leave space to breathe and refocus. And that's one of the aspects, is that we sit with a lot and we connect with so many pieces of information, but it's what I can do anything with what I have, but how do I prioritize that? Not to also get overwhelmed, because mental health is such a key part of actually building this level of sustainability that we need to progress and move our society in spaces. But also at the same time, don't get too comfortable. So trying something new and being a novice at it, it takes courage and humility. But when you suck at something, it also builds your confidence when you actually reach the next level and reach a goal outside your realm of working. And I think that those two pieces of advice that I've learned through doing is something that I keep really close to my heart, because there's a quote I heard, which was, wherever you go, there you are. And you always want to be proud of the person you are, wherever you are. And so I just wish the resilience to all of you, and thank you so much for the space and the time. This was an amazing platform. So thank you so much. And thank you, Hope and Sharon. It was really great.
Thank you, Neoka. And Hope, do you have any final words for us?
No, I think Neoka, that is beautiful. And I think, just to echo what she said, a lot of the work in the world in trying to create change can be overwhelming. And you can only, I guess, give from a cup that's full. And this is one of the things that I've also learned over time. So then, just making sure that, again, you're able to kind of find sustainable ways to take care of yourself. You're able to find things that will keep you going, like your why. And then also being able to make sure that you share the load, right? So you build communities, you collaborate with many other people so that you can collectively drive that change. So I think, just 100% echoing what Neoka said, that really take care of yourself, take care of your mental health. And I think that's really just part of the things that are key in terms of sustaining that change. But thank you so much. As mentioned, I went TCT, so it's always great to engage with the community. So thank you so much for this invite, and it was really great getting to know you, Neoka, and thank you for the invite, Sharon.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, Hope. Thank you, Neoka. And just a reminder to our viewers that this is the first part of our webinar series. Next week, we'll be hosting student leaders who will be chatting to us about student leadership and governance. And then the final week, we'll be chatting about feminism and politics. So thank you all for joining us. Same time next week. Goodbye and have a good evening.